Welcome back to episode 2 of what I hope to be a long series of conversations with composers. It's just an excuse for me to really pick the brains of amazing musicians and find out how they operate and what kind of things they're thinking about when they're making the music that they make. And I'm really pleased to be joined today by Kyle Wernke. Kyle Wernke is a composer of thrilling modern music that's been performed at home and abroad. Kyle has had performances by some of the finest ensembles in new music, including Ensemble Signal, members of the Mivos Quartet, Hypercube, and the Hart School's Foot in the Door Ensemble. An avid composer for large ensemble, Wernke's music has been finding a home with orchestras across the globe. His 2017 work for orchestra, Burst, has been recorded by the Brno Philharmonic for a Blaze Records album, Orchestral Masters Volume 6. As well as having performances by the Tampa Bay Symphony and the Musique en Scène Orchestra in Paris, France. Thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Any day that I get to talk to Andrei Stolyarov is always a good day as far as I'm concerned.
Nice. That's awesome. How have you been spending 2020 and now 2021? Has it been a musically and creatively fruitful time? Has it been not?
So I think for me, even though I only finished one piece, it's actually been a pretty fruitful time. The other piece that I'm working on is a huge piece for orchestra and chorus. And I'm waiting on text from my librettist who's very, very busy. So it's given me a chance to also explore some other things. But I think it's been fruitful, but it's also been a chance for me to kind of figure out what works best for me, because all of a sudden deadlines were gone, right? You didn't have to finish anything really in any set amount of time. And so I was able to figure out that I honestly work best when I can have a couple of days to decompress between, large chunks of writing, because I'll go for 3, 4, 5 hours at a time. And I figured out that doing that 2 or 3 days in a row oftentimes is not how I get my best work. And so I was able to realize that by taking breaks for myself to read or to prep for classes, it really gave me that recharging energy. And so on the one hand, it was kind of good because deadlines were gone and I could figure that out myself. But I also know that eventually deadlines are going to come back and I'm not going to have the opportunity to do that the same way that I did this year.
Yeah, take the time while you can.
Right.
So you said you were working on a big project, but you haven't quite finished that yet because you're waiting for texts. Were there any smaller projects that you were working
on? So I was going to go to the mostly modern festival before it was canceled. And I worked on a small piece for oboe, viola, and harp that I think turned out really well. I'm really proud of that piece. And then I did some revisions of another orchestra piece that I had written years ago and I thought was just too bloated. One of the things I've learned as I've gotten older is when to know when your piece is done. And it's something I didn't know when I wrote that piece. And so there are large swaths of it that don't need to be there. So I took some time to do that. And then I started a song cycle at the end of the year because I was really interested in setting text and I had just been spending a lot of time with Schumann's song cycles, and so I thought, why not? I haven't written one in 7 years, and so I started writing one, the poetry of Walter de la Mare from England.
Beautiful. So have you always known that you were going to be a composer?
No, it was by no means a sure thing. My mom oftentimes likes to remind me that when I was really little, I wanted to be a taxi driver because I saw the dog do it on Muppet Babies. But for most of my childhood, I actually wanted to be like a comic actor. Unfortunately, it turns out you have to be funny to do that. So
I would argue that you are one of the funnier musicians that I know.
Well, I really appreciate that, Andre. Could you tell my wife that?
Okay.
She says I have one funny thing a month.
That's a pretty good batting average, I'd say.
I guess that's true, but if you consider the number of jokes that I say in a month, it's really not that good. But I went through a couple things after I started music before I landed on composer. My first thought was that I wanted to be a professional saxophone player, and I would play in the Saturday Night Live band because I was like, how cool would that be? Just watch skits all day and play my saxophone. It turns out you have to be like really good at the saxophone to do that, and I'm I even hesitate to say I'm good, but I'm not like bad, but I'm not that level, and I figured out pretty quickly that I wasn't going to be. And then I thought I'd be a band director, but then I heard John Williams score for Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone on a car trip from Indianapolis to the Outer Banks, or no, I'm sorry, it was Virginia Beach. And I got in the CD the Christmas before from my next door neighbor, and I had just been like, oh, great, whatever. It's just, orchestra music. And then I listened to it, and by the time we got to Virginia Beach, I think I listened to the whole album 3 or 4 times. And I knew then that that's what I had been looking for. That's what I was supposed to be doing. And even from there, it wasn't like a linear shot. There were other things I was interested in. Even as late as high school, I thought about going into politics. But when it came time to apply for colleges, it was pretty obvious that I was going to be applying for music programs.
And did you apply for a music program in composition or something else?
A composition. I applied only to one school, which in retrospect is probably not the best idea. I only applied to Butler University because I had been studying with Michael Shelley for 2 years already. And I loved him. And to this day, he's such a close friend and mentor. So I knew I wanted to study with him. So I only applied there, and I only applied in composition. And I had intended to declare a minor in political science that never materialized.
So I know, Kyle, that you are also a conductor, and I know you did your master's in conducting, and I wonder, how does the conducting influence your composition, and maybe vice versa? How does your knowledge of composition influence the way that you approach conducting an ensemble?
So I think that my preference, and I hesitate to use that word because my preferences fluctuate, of course, from moment to moment. For large ensemble music, to compose that, to listen to that, I think comes from my background as a conductor. And the countless hours of score study that I spend doing every year. And I think that spending my time with those scores has influenced me as a composer in innumerable ways. I mean, you can take an orchestration class, and that's great, but you learn how to orchestrate from looking at what great orchestrators did before you. And that's the job of a conductor, is to study a score and to understand how things work together, how to balance things, what the composer's intent is when they do this doubling. And all of that comes out in composition then when you're writing a piece for large ensemble or even small ensemble, when you think about those doublings and how to balance things. So I'm constantly thinking about my time as a conductor when I am composing, and vice versa when I'm on the podium and I'm coming up to a section that I necessarily don't understand or that is giving me some trouble. I'll think about, as a composer, if I had written this section of music, what would I want? Now, I'm not Tchaikovsky or Beethoven, so chances are I'm wrong a lot of the time, but it does give me a justification sometimes to kind of say, this is why I did it, even if everyone else disagrees, which, they could.
So you've mentioned a few names already, but I'm wondering if you can hone in on this a little bit more about who are your biggest musical inspirations. Maybe you could talk about your composing inspirations, and then if you wanted to talk about conducting inspirations too, that'd be great. Maybe if you can have a top five. I know that's really hard, but what do you think?
So I was actually thinking about this question when I saw that you asked Aaron that, and I think it's so hard to differentiate between like the composers who were mentors to me and then the composers who influenced me just like through their music and through their sound. Now, Aaron was saying that he doesn't really write much music without thinking about Jill the Lions. And for me, that's Michael Shelley. I studied with him for 6 years. I talked to him almost, every day about one thing or another. And so I don't write much music without thinking about him and the influence from him that I had when I was so young and still learning what I was doing. But on the other hand, I don't think I think about development of ideas without thinking about Robert Carl, or text setting without thinking about Larry Allen Smith or Ken Steen. So obviously, those four are huge influences on me, by nature of the fact that I studied with them and spent so much time with them. And they got to know my music so intimately, and I got to know their teaching style and, in many instances, their music intimately. Um, but as far as composers who I have either met other places, or composers that I have just listened to and really their music has resonated with me. I mean, John Williams is the reason I'm a composer. There's no getting around that. Harry Potter changed my life, and as corny as that might sound, it's really true.
Hmm.
Um, Stravinsky, of course. I love Stravinsky. I love Beethoven, Robert Schumann, um, Schnittke, whose chamber music especially is a huge influence on me, his piano trio. And then like some of the living composers like Stephen Hartke or Chen Yi or Anna Klein, who has a really wonderful piece called Masquerade that I just am in awe of every time I listen to it. It's so beautifully orchestrated. Um, and I had the opportunity to meet those three composers, and Lei Liang from I think UC San Diego, who was also a huge influence when I met him at June in Buffalo a few years ago. Um, I think the act of being a composer is accumulating these people who influence you, and being willing to let that group of composers or sounds evolve and change as you get older, because if you don't evolve and change, then you're doing something wrong, I think.
Absolutely.
um, as far as conductors, I mean, the top two for me are George Zell and Leonard Bernstein.
Hmm.
They are my absolute favorites.
Do you ever find yourself channeling either of them on the podium?
I find myself trying to, but it's so hard. It's so hard to have the breadth of knowledge of George Zell and the sheer, how do I want to put this, the mastery of movement of Leonard Bernstein.
Hmm.
Uh, no one moves like him, and so as much as I try, I'm never going to be Leonard Bernstein. But I think about him in every gesture.
Yeah. Who knows? Maybe in however many years, somebody's going to say that about you.
Well, isn't that the dream?
I wonder, what is your process like? For me personally, I'm constantly like, I feel like I'm reinventing myself with every piece, but I'm constantly going back to the same couple of tropes that I feel like inch their way into every piece. So I wonder, what do you do when you're writing a piece of music? How do you start? Do you find yourself constantly evolving, or do you stick to a certain process? What do you think?
That's a hard question, because I've tried so many different things. So it's common for a composer to say that every time they sit down to write something, they realize that they don't know what they're doing. I mean, John Adams has said it. Aaron Wyansky said this in episode one, The Phantom Menace. Um, but it really is true. Every time I sit down and I've had this great idea, or what I think is a great idea, it almost always starts with me thinking, how do I get it from here to there? And that's the difficult part. So I tried lots of things. I tried, sketching it out just with like dots and dashes and pictures and all that kind of thing. Um, and I've tried starting in the middle. I've started starting in the end. At the end of the day, what works for me is just writing down the part that first came to me,
Hmm.
whether that ends up being the beginning, the middle, or the end. I don't make the distinction of that's where it is. I just kind of put it down, and then I write, and I just see where it goes. And sometimes it goes to the middle. Sometimes I realize that this is the beginning of the piece, and sometimes I realize that really this is things winding down and it's the end. That is the least frequent option, but sometimes it does happen. Um, like Burst, for example, I started from the beginning and I wrote to the end. But pretty quickly in the writing process, I realized that what I had for the beginning wasn't the full beginning. And I was going through and I was inserting measures. And I think the beginning was or what I consider the beginning of the piece was originally 20 or 30 seconds, and it eventually ended up being like 2 or 3 minutes
Hmm.
by virtue of adding things in and expanding things and developing ideas as they went.
So do you find that when you're just starting out, are you being guided by just inspiration spur of the moment, or are you doing a lot of pre-planning?
This is probably not the composerly thing to say, but I don't pre-plan very much. And by that, I suppose I mean I don't write things down.
Hmm.
Like it's not like I write down like, okay, I'm going to start this way, I'm going to go here, and I'm going to end here because I feel like that boxes me in.
Hmm.
So when I start to write, I just kind of I have an idea of what I want the piece to be, but normally that's not what the piece ends up being because I write myself into different things based off of how I'm feeling that day, based off of how many people broke into the Capitol building that afternoon. Um, and so I think flexibility is probably the most important tool that I have in being willing to change my idea of a piece partway through or almost all the way through. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I hope it kind of does.
Absolutely. And it ties in beautifully to my next question, which is, what do you have in terms of advice for composers who are just starting out, or just getting going in the process of becoming a composer? What kind of advice do you have for them?
So this is part of my weekly routine because I work with so many young composers by teaching the composition students at the University of Missouri St. Louis. And if I had to boil it down to one thing, I couldn't do it. But if I could boil it down to two things, I can.
Perfect.
So if that's all right, the first one, and I think one that gets shuffled in the mix, is listen to anything and everything that you can. You would not believe how many times I will ask a young composer what they're listening to, and their answer is, "Well, I'm not really listening to anything right now." That's not going to cut it.
Hmm.
You have to be voracious in your listening. You have to be interested and checking into everything, even if you don't like it. That's fine. Goodness knows there's music I don't like, but I only know that I don't like it because I listen to it.
Right.
And there's music that I love now that I didn't like when I was younger. I'm always taken back to something I heard David McBride say when I worked at the Allen Library, and he was checking out like all of the Wagner operas.
Hmm.
And I was chatting with him about it, and he said, "Well, every 5 years or so, I listen to all of them just to make sure I still don't like it."
Wow, that's
And
amazing.
yeah, I was it that moment changed something for me. And I started going back and kind of listening to things that I had dismissed and thought I didn't like, and finding that some of it I really did like.
Huh.
Some of it I still don't, but some of it I really did. When I was younger, I didn't like Schoenberg. I didn't get it, but now I love Schoenberg. Every time that things start to warm up in the spring, for whatever reason, I have got to listen to it Vartan, and I've got to listen to the Five Pieces for Orchestra. It's just there every year. I
Hmm.
just feel that need to do that. I didn't 10 years ago. Um, so listening is so important for us as composers because if you don't listen, you have no idea what's out there, and if what you're doing is has been done before, or if what you're doing is related to something else, and finding another piece can help you figure out how to do what you're trying to do. It's really our bread and butter as composers. Um, the other piece of advice is not to be afraid of making mistakes,
Hmm.
musical mistakes specifically, but mistakes in general, because you learn from mistakes. Oftentimes, a piece does not go the way that I wanted it to, but it goes in a better way because my finger slipped on the piano, or because I didn't transpose properly when I was putting something into Dorica or Finale. And I think, well, that actually sounds better
Hmm.
than the way I had it. So don't be afraid of those mistakes. And if a mistake happens that you like, you're the creator. You are the one who's making this art. You can change your vision to match this new sound that you found that you really like. Mistakes are so crucial to being an artist of any kind. And I think we oftentimes have this idea that we have to do things properly. And it's the 21st century. There is no properly anymore. Five does not go to one. Five goes wherever you want it to be, if it's five at all.
Yeah. I think that is just one of the most important pieces of advice to give anybody. On all fronts, on all musical in all musical categories and even beyond music. Just don't be afraid to sound bad and make a mistake, which will
Right.
end up being, the new thing.
It was a famous trumpet player, I can't remember which one, who said that if he sounded in the practice room like he did on the performance stage, he was doing something wrong. And that's absolutely true.
Hmm.
The practice room is where you make mistakes because you learn from those mistakes. If you sound perfect, then what's the point?
Exactly.
You got to find something new to practice.
Exactly. So you've talked about some of your creative projects from last year. What about this year? Do you have any projects coming up that you're going to be working on? I mean, you mentioned your oratorio, and yeah, what do you got going on?
The oratorio is it has to be done by the end of the spring semester. So that is my primary focus. But I would really like to write another piano trio. I love that genre, and I love piano trios. I've written one, and I'd like to write another one. So that's a piece I'd like to get into. And then yesterday, and I don't know if this will come to anything, but I just kind of started drafting an idea for a concerto for viola and wind ensemble. I
Hmm.
thought that'd be kind of interesting, and my wife is a wonderful violist, so viola music, I guess I write a little bit of it sometimes.
Not
But
many pieces like that. Viola and wind ensemble.
and that's what kind of interested me when I was kind of thinking about this idea. It came up with this idea originally of just these trombone glisses out of nowhere, and then I thought, well, what if they were on viola and then they passed to the trombone and back and forth, and then I just started sketching. I don't know if it'll go anywhere, and it might not go anywhere for 4 or 5 years. Who knows? But it's an idea that I had. But honestly, it's the oratorio. That's what I've got to finish next year. And if I can finish that, I almost feel like I would be happy enough to give myself like a month or two of a break.
I mean,
Like
that's
I
a
did after I
daunting
finished my
project.
dissertation, where I don't think I wrote anything for like a year after I finished my
Wow.
dissertation. I was a broken person.
I don't blame you. Well, your dissertation was a massive project.
Yeah, that was a lot to do in a year, and I needed that year off to remember that there are other things to do besides write an opera.
For those who don't know, what was your dissertation?
I wrote an opera based off of a Stephen King novel, The Wind Through the Keyhole, and that was an hour of spending, or a year of spending most of my life um, just diving into the works of Stephen King. And while I love Stephen King, man, I needed a break for a while. I was done with that work, both from reading horror fiction and science fiction, and from composing. And I think I read like nothing but like feel good novels and history like the next year.
Where can we find more of your work?
You can find most of my work by going to kylewernke.com, where I have recordings of most of my pieces up there. My pieces are currently in the process of being published by Just a Theory Press, so you can go there to purchase some of at least one of my chamber pieces and two of my large ensemble works, Burst for orchestra and Formations for wind ensemble. And yeah, I have a SoundCloud too, but everything you can find on SoundCloud is on my website.
Beautiful. And if you're a first time listener of the music of Kyle Wernke, where should you start?
Um, I think honestly, if you want like a whirlwind explanation of who I am as a composer, Burst is probably your best first stop.
Hmm.
Um, if you want me at arguably my most angsty, most upset, Trio in Memoriam David McBride.
Okay. Okay. I think that would be very appropriate for these times.
Yeah, and as I was watching everything unfold yesterday, I honestly, and this is not me like saying it for the benefit of the camera. I was thinking about David and how he was so genuinely kind and humble, and how if everyone were like him, we would not have the division that we have. And he's a soul that we need now more than ever.
Absolutely. Yeah, he would be absolutely horrified with
Yeah.
everything going on. Wow. Well, thank you so much, Kyle. This has been an amazing conversation. I always love talking to you, and now I'm I'm so pleased that you could share your thoughts with all of us here on the internets.
Well, thank you for thinking of me, Andre. Like I said at the beginning, any day I get to talk to Andre Stoliarov is a great day for me, and I'm I'm really pleased that you're doing this, and that so many composers are going to kind of get to talk about their process and their thoughts and feelings, and I think it's wonderful that you're doing this for all of us and your listeners and watchers.
Yeah, so listeners and watchers, if you like this content, if you want to see more, please hit the subscribe button, like the video, leave a comment if you have any questions for Kyle. And otherwise, I will see you next time.